know what that they were attracted by that dying rabbit call, and they were trying to get to me. And if I hadn't gotten the van when I did, if I'd have been farther away from the van, I probably wouldn't have made it back to the van. Killed in his own yard and dragged half a mile up a bluff side. And they said that was wild dogs. Dogs don't do that. He said, decided it didn't want fish anymore, it wanted him. He managed to avoid getting killed by crawling up in the rafters of the cabin and shooting down at this thing as it continued to attack him. And he sat there for a second, and he looked at me and he goes, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to pay attention. I said, okay. He goes, one caught to another, I would drop this.
In this episode, I have a very special guest for all of us, a good friend of mine. His name is D.A. Roberts. Now, what makes D.A. Roberts really special is he's actually retired law enforcement and has some pretty crazy stories about not just his experiences, but things happening in and around our own country. And in today's episode, he's going to be sharing with us some of his horrific experiences while in LBL, among a host of other strange, creepy, and supernatural things. You guys will not want to miss this episode. It is intense. So, D.A. Roberts, take it away, buddy.
My name is D.A. Roberts. I'm a best-selling author, Amazon multiple times. I write primarily horror and science fiction, but I've been investigating cryptids since I was a kid. Spent most of my adult life in one uniform or another. I was in law enforcement for the better part of 20 years. Served as a corrections officer, a security officer. I led a hospital security detachment. I was a supervisor, a patrol supervisor. I've run the gamut. I've been everything but pretty much a detective. I didn't go into that, but I've always enjoyed the work. It was something I was always proud of. Something I was always pretty good at. And I kind of had to keep most of that quiet while I was still active, because that's not the kind of thing you want to get brought up on the witness stand when you're trying to put somebody in jail for a crime. But you don't want the prosecuting attorney or the defense attorney going, "Tell me about your Bigfoot research," and making you look like an idiot on the defense stand. But we still did a lot of investigating. My sons and I, friends and I, we would still get out in the woods. We just kept it quiet. And I found that if you could get most officers away from a formal setting, a lot of cops had stories. I would go to training seminars. Training seminars. We go to training seminars, and I would meet officers from other agencies, and I would say, hey, what do you think about this kind of thing? And sometimes I'd get, that's crap, but you'd be surprised the number of times I'd be like, hey, I'll tell you a story, but you can't tell my name, and you can't say what department I'm with, because I'm still active, and this could really bite me in the butt. I've talked to judges who had stories. I've talked to lawyers who've had stories. A couple of doctors who had stories. People that with a lot to lose by coming forward. Because when you're a seated judge or a prosecuting attorney or something like that, your credibility is every ounce on the line. And the last thing you want is somebody dragging, oh, so you saw Bigfoot, huh? But a lot of these guys would tell you stories just on the condition that you just not ever reveal who they were publicly. A lot of them said, after I retire years from now, I'll probably tell this story publicly. And if you're still doing what you're doing, I'd be happy to do something a little more public. But until I retire, no chance. Talked to guys from Missouri Department of Conservation. I've talked to people that were just family friends that I never would have imagined had seen something like that, and had never ever mentioned it in family circles. But when you get them alone, like going deer hunting, you get guys at deer camp, they'll tell you stories. So I've been really digging into this mystery for a very long time. Primarily Bigfoot. Probably within the last 10 years is when I started getting into dogman. I'd heard stories about Wolfman and the wild wolfmen of the woods and things like that. And there's even a local Ozarks legend of the beast of the lake, which is supposedly seen up near Lake of the Ozarks. But it wasn't something I really truly got into as much as I had Bigfoot. All that kind of changed when I started researching some of the books. I started looking at some of the more shall we say, infamous dogman stories, like the multiple incidents that have happened in Land Between the Lakes. So after I retired, this was about 2 years ago, but it's been 2 years ago, July, I decided that I was going to make a trip to Land Between the Lakes.
Folks, D.A. Roberts, we made it. Land Between the Lakes.
One, to research books, and two, just to really kind of experience the place for myself. I was, arranging to meet a friend of mine, Nick Valente. I was going to meet him there, but I beat him there by about 3 days. I was there for the better part of a week, and Nick got there on, I think, my third day there. So the first couple of days, I was just running around LBL by myself, which, retrospect, probably not the brightest thing I've ever done in my life, especially since you're not supposed to go armed in a national preserve like that. I'm not saying I was completely unarmed, but I wasn't carrying anything serious. So I was still at the mercy of the elements, and I had some weird things happen. While recording near the Nickel Cemetery, I've just had my camera set up on a tripod. At several times, if you watch the video, which is still up on my YouTube channel, you can see me stop and look off of camera several times as I'm hearing something moving around. And at a couple points, you can actually hear something crunching in the leaves. So I'm like, you know what? I'm kind of out here by myself, and I've got nothing really to defend myself. So maybe this is probably not the brightest place for me to be. So I shut the camera down, and I'm like, you know what the hell? I grabbed a rather large knife, and I headed into the trees. I wanted to see if I could see something. And as I started heading into the trees, I could hear it moving away. I could hear it again on the other side of the cemetery, but it never got close to me again. And I was like, probably ought to just move on out of this area. One of the things I want to really say about LBL, and that it was really bizarre, excuse me, is it was different than any place I've ever been. I've been through the woods most of my life. I've hunted and fished and backpacked and camped all over the Ozarks and areas around it, gone out through the Rocky Mountains, and if it's a rugged area in the United States to hunt and fish, I've probably been there. But LBL was different. We stayed just across the canal from the north end of LBL, a little town called Grand Rivers. But when you would cross the bridge into North LBL, you could feel it. You could feel the change. Just something about the place. Outside of LBL, over in Grand Rivers and around the campgrounds and stuff that were around where we were staying, you could see deer and possum and squirrels and fish and turtles. You saw animals everywhere. But as soon as you crossed into northern LBL, nothing. The entire time I was there, which was pretty much a week, I never saw one animal in the north end of LBL, not even roadkill. And that is bizarre. To not see any animals at all in a heavily forested area like that is really, really strange. And some of that areas back there in LBL are really, really densely wooded. It's one thing for someone to go to a park and say, yeah, there's a lot of trees here, we really like it. But it's totally different when you step out in the woods and everything is just wild and overgrown. Fallen trees, heavy thick cover on the ground of leaves, branches that are grabbing at your face, brambles. It was thick. It was hard to, if there wasn't a trail, it was very difficult to pick your way through parts of the LBL. Very, very dense, very foreboding place. And the infamous incident that most people are aware of with LBL, with a family of 4 that was supposedly killed back in '82, turns out I was within a few yards of the place and never knew it. I was looking for that spot. But it's there's the main road through LBL runs north to south. It's called the Trace. And there's an area heads off to the east off of the Trace called Demumbers Bay. And it's just off that road to Demumbers Bay. So I drove by the exact spot where that incident happened probably a dozen times, because I went down to Demumbers Bay several times. But I did have some weird things happen to me personally down at Demumbers Bay. My first night there, I decided I would just drive around. And my wife and my son were at the condo. And I went into LBL. And I had a little Dodge Grand Caravan minivan at the time. And I was carrying gear with me at this point. I wasn't wearing it, so if I got out of the van, it was going to be in the van. But I did take something to defend myself. So I drive down to Demumbers Bay, and there's nobody camping there. And these are all primitive campsites. There's no power hookups, no water hookups, not like you would expect when you go to a campground. These are all very primitive sites. So basically anything you take in, anything you need, you have to pack in. If you want electricity, you better have a generator because it's not out there. So I pulled down to the actual part of Demumbers Bay, which looks out over this little bay that comes off of I can't remember. I think it's Kentucky Lake. It's the lake on the east side, and I'm just kind of looking around. I kind of pulled slowly around the parking lot with my headlights on bright. I didn't see anything, and there's a pretty big open area where people could camp. There was nobody there, so I pull down, and there's an old concrete boat ramp that leads down to the water, where people could back trailers in and launch boats. So I kind of pulled down onto that ramp with my headlights playing out over the water. And I wasn't close to the water. I was probably 20, 30 yards up the ramp from the water. And I just stopped the van and got out and listened. And it was really quiet. So I walked down to the water's edge, and I had my cell phone with me and a little flashlight. And I was looking for tracks in the mud at the edge of the water. And that's a really great place to look for tracks in wild places. I found lots of partials, and I found some really interesting tracks over the years right at the edge of the water because everything needs water. So I'm not really finding anything right there at the boat ramp. So I kind of headed off a little bit to the north, following the shoreline, which there was just enough gap between the trees and the shoreline where I could walk without getting in the water. And I walked for a little ways, and I was probably 50 yards away from the car, from the van. Maybe not quite that far, but when it's over broken terrain, the distance it gets nasty because it's hard to run on broken terrain, especially in the dead of night. But I used to use predator calls to attract coyotes when I was younger. We would hunt coyotes for bounties because coyotes population had exploded, and they were a nuisance animal here in Missouri. And the Missouri Department of Conservation was putting a bounty out on bringing coyotes down because they were killing livestock. So I had used predator calls a number of times to lure in coyotes. So I pulled up a few of them that I had on my phone and looked around and thought, I'll try dying rabbit. Which is, if you ever heard the dying rabbit call, it's a rabbit screaming. Rabbits will scream. I mean, horrifyingly scream when they're under attack or dying, and they'll make a tremendous amount of racket. Most people don't realize how much noise a rabbit can make. But I didn't have a Bluetooth speaker. I was just playing it through the speaker on my phone. But the odd thing is I don't know if you've ever played any music or talked to somebody right at the edge of water at night. The acoustics over water at night act different than you wouldn't expect. Sound seems to travel at night over water far more than I've ever I can really explain. I'm sure there's physics behind it, but I've noticed this camping at rivers, and I've been, fishing on lakes. Sound just travels over water, especially at night. Sounds that you would think would be almost inaudible at more than 20 feet away come in loud and clear. So I got really pretty good amplification on this dying rabbit call. So I played it and let it run for about 20 seconds, and then I shut it off to listen, and I could hear something coming toward me in the woods, and it was moving pretty fast. It came at me from 3 different directions in the woods behind me. So my only course of action was in the water or farther down the shore, one of the ways. I hadn't brought a firearm with me, and I'm like, yeah, this is probably not the greatest place to get caught, especially considering how far I am from the van. So I start making my way down the shore back to the van, and I can hear these things, whatever they are, still coming toward me in the woods. So I hustle up the ramp, jump in the van, slam the door and lock the door, fire the engine up, throw the headlights up on bright, and I back up into the campsite and let my bright lights, play out across the woods from where I was just at. and I saw several sets of green eye shine. And I've heard people say that dogman eye shine usually comes back either red or gold. This was green. I didn't see anything other than the eye shine, and the eye shine was high enough off the ground that it wasn't just a deer or something like that. Whatever these were coming toward me. They wanted to know what that they were attracted by that dying rabbit call, and they were trying to get to me. And if I hadn't gotten the van when I did, if I'd have been farther away from the van, I probably wouldn't have made it back to the van. And I learned a pretty valuable lesson. I don't care what the posted signs say. I'm not going unarmed anywhere like that again. Told my wife about it. She goes, "You're an idiot. Don't be doing that anymore." But Demumbers Bay is a very creepy area, even in the daylight. Just something about that place. It's just got an energy all its own. And it was after I left LBL that I heard another story of a couple, a man and a woman that was supposedly killed right there in Demumbers Bay in the campground. There's several people have reported the story, but it was supposedly witnessed by a guy from the Game and Fish Department who was out just at dawn fishing in Demumbers Bay, and he saw this thing creeping up on this couple as they were getting out of their tent, and he was yelling at them, trying to get their attention. And before they saw it, it attacked them. And he didn't go after it because he figured he'd have just joined it. But he was basically told to shut up about it. So I don't know for sure if this story is true. But that's the thing when you hear these accounts and stories. Unless you were there, you've got no way to know if any of them were true. And as a cop, basically what I do is I evaluate these stories, and I evaluate the person that's telling me the story if I can take the account firsthand, and then I evaluate the details in a story. And as a writer, that's really, really helped me as well, because I look for inconsistencies in the story. I look for little things that don't make sense. And I've come across a number of stories over the years that I thought were just total hokum. But then you talk to some people and you see the fear in their eyes and the goose pimples on their arms as they're telling you the story. They're not making that up. They're reliving a horrific experience. And Demumbers Bay is, to me, it's one of the creepiest places I've ever been. While we were there in LBL, while we were waiting for Nick to get there, I kind of walked around a little bit there at the little town called Grand Rivers. It's not a very big place. There's a couple of restaurants, a little bitty grocery store, and a few houses. Not a whole lot there. The resort we stayed at is there. It's called the Green Turtle Bay Resort. Really neat little place if you're ever in that area. It's a cool place to stay. But I wouldn't recommend going over an LBL by yourself. But as I was walking around Grand Rivers, I got one of two reactions from people if I asked about the LBL stories. Either they said, nope, never heard of anything like that, and then wouldn't talk to me anymore. Or they got angry and wouldn't talk to me anymore. I got thrown out of a bait shop when I asked a guy about it. He said, I don't want to talk about that and you need to leave my store. And I was like, okay, this is bizarre. And he would not talk to me anymore. He didn't physically grab me and throw me out of his store. He just basically told me to leave. There was a little place there called Cave Pizza. They make a really good pizza. But the guy that was at the counter clammed up immediately when I started asking him about LBL. He's like, I don't know nothing about that place. I don't go over there. I stay out of there. The locals say that's a bad place. I don't know nothing about it. And that was all he would say. Then I ran into a deputy sheriff. And I won't say his name because he certainly didn't, give me the indication that he wanted to be on the record for anything. And I wouldn't out another cop. And I walked up and I introduced myself, told him I was a writer, and I was there researching the area. He's like, oh, you a big fisherman? Are you writing an outdoor type book? I said, no. I said, I'm writing about the incidents in LBL. And he got real quiet. So I took out my wallet and I showed him my credentials. I said, I'm a retired cop. I'm here investigating for a book, and I just wanted to get, an honest take on this. And he sat there for a second, and then he looked at me and he goes, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to pay attention. I said, okay. He goes, one cop to another, I would drop this. He said, I would not pursue this. And he turned and walked away, and he wouldn't talk to me about it anymore.
It's wild, man.
Yeah.
Wow.
We ended up staying a couple extra nights. We were only planning on staying 5 days, and we stayed at the resort. But when as the 5th day was coming, I told my wife, I said, "Hey, can we stay a couple extra days? I'm still really not quite done." And she said, "Well, we can't get the condo that's already booked." So we looked around. When the nearest hotel we could find was in a place called Paducah, Kentucky, which is about 10 minutes away. It really wasn't very far. So we got a hotel for the next couple of nights in Paducah and moved our stuff over there and went and got something to eat before I went back there that evening. And everybody in Paducah was willing to talk about it. In fact, when I was talking about it with some people, there were other people would say, "Oh, you talking about what goes on in LBL?" And they would come and tell me stories. I probably got 20 people telling me their stories. In Paducah, they're like, "Oh yeah, there's something bizarre going on over there." And we don't, one guy told me that he was trolling with his fishing boat early one morning, and he said he rounded a little bend, kind of into a little slough that goes back into the woods a little bit, and right there along LBL. And he was, trolling motors are very quiet, and he said that he was just sitting there fishing and just moving into that bay, that little slough, very slowly, and he saw this thing at the edge of the water. He said it looked like it was eating a fish. He said, but when it saw me, he says it stood up, and he said it looked like a dang werewolf. It was completely black, and it came out in the water toward the boat. He said it was coming. And I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, I fired up the big engine and I got the hell out of there, and I don't fish over there anymore. I stick to this side of the lake. He said once he realized what was coming at his boat, he was all about, turning off the trolling motor, turning on the big motor, and putting as much distance as he could. He said it was between 6 and 7 feet tall. He said it wasn't built super strong, like people describe them as bodybuilders. He said this thing was built more like for speed, and dark colored, which oddly enough matches the description of the one I saw on my last day in LBL. He said it was coming through the water at a pretty high rate of speed. He said once it got to water beyond it, up to its chest, it slowed it down. He said, but when it was like hip deep in water, it was coming fast. He said, I don't hunt or fish over there anymore. He says, especially you get close to dark. I don't want to be anywhere near that place. He said, decided it didn't want fish anymore. It wanted him. On our last day in the park, Nick and I actually saw one. Nick Valente and I actually saw one. We had gone down to Demumbers Bay and looked around a little bit and didn't really see anything going on. There was a couple guys fishing, but nothing really going on in Demumbers Bay. And what we were doing is Nick has a big SUV. He's got an H3 Hummer, and with a good 4-wheel drive unit. So what we started doing is a lot of these primitive campsites set way back off the road in the trees. There's little, barely more than a trail where you can take a vehicle down to it. But a lot of these campsites are set back in the trees. And so we were driving back slowly, like 3 or 4 miles an hour, just creeping, looking through the trees for these campsites. Nick was looking on the left side. I was looking on the right side of the road. And what we're hoping to see is either somebody camping that we could talk to, or maybe find a campsite we could look for tracks, or worst case scenario, a campsite that looked like it had been abandoned or torn up. We did see a couple guys fishing at the low water bridge, but they didn't act like they wanted to talk at all. So we continued on, and as you leave Demumbers Bay, there's a little bit of the road, and then there's a concrete bridge that covers like an inlet. And on the other side of that concrete bridge, back toward the trace, is where we started slowing really down. And we were maybe 100, 125 yards past that bridge, not far. And I was looking out the passenger side, and I had my phone in my hand, just like this, with the camera app up, ready to record something. In retrospect, I probably should have just been recording the whole time, and then went back and edited stuff out. But I don't have at the time, the phone I had didn't have a whole lot of memory, so I didn't want to run constantly. Every deer I'd ever shot while hunting, only reason I saw it is because it moved. If something is sitting dead still in the woods, we're not really trained to, our brains really aren't wired to spot it. So every deer I've ever got, I only realized it was there was because it was moving. When it was dead still, it was almost impossible to see. And that was the case I ran into with this. As we're driving down the road, I was looking out to the right through the trees, and I saw something that was maybe 30 yards off the road, and the undergrowth was thin enough right there at the edge of the road we could see back into the trees for a little bit. But it didn't really click what I was looking at until I started, as we started to pass it and I was looking beyond it. That's when it turned its head and looked right at me. And when it moved, I keyed right in on it. I instantly saw it. And I'm, still phone in hand, I'm hitting Nick in the shoulder, telling him to stop and look. And he slams on the brakes and looks. And I got a pretty good look at this thing. I saw it for 15 to 20 seconds. Nick probably saw it for in the ballpark of 10 to 15 seconds. And this thing, it was strongly built, but not like a bodybuilder. It looked like a dog on its hind legs. You could see the hocked legs. You could see the hand, because it had its right hand against a tree, like it was just leaning against this tree watching us. The head was roughly shaped like a wolf, but the snout was different. The snout looked more like a Rottweiler or a Mastiff. It didn't have the heavy jowls, but it was shorter and blunter, wider. It didn't look, it wasn't like a narrow snout like on a wolf or a collie or a German Shepherd. This was shorter and blunter. And I can tell you from owning a couple of Mastiffs, I can tell you the bite pressure those things have. I've seen them splinter femur bones from cattle. The bite pressure on that thing had to have been enormous. So I'm pointing at it, and again, the whole time I'm yelling and trying to get Nick's attention, never once thought of turning on that camera in my hand. Didn't even enter my brain. I mean, I was just totally, absolutely freaking out at what I saw. And Nick throws it in park. We pile out, and this thing takes off. And it did kind of one of the weirdest runs I've ever seen. It didn't just turn around and take off running like we would. There was a ravine behind it that kind of dropped down back toward the lake. And it turned and did this kind of side-to-side bounding. It sprang to the right, sprang to the left, sprang to the right, and then went down that ravine. And we could hear it smacking through bushes and everything. It was hauling ass. So we go trucking out there to where it was. And that ravine was pretty rough. We knew the two of us weren't going to be pursuing it down that ravine anytime soon, not without ropes. But it was just gone. I mean, incredibly fast. So I went back over to the spot where I'd seen it, right to the exact tree, and I was able to reach up and put my hand where its hand was. But it was like if I'd been leaning against the tree, my hand would have been lower. If you lean against a tree, your hand's going to be roughly shoulder level. It's going to be comfortable level. That thing was the hand where its hand was slightly above my head, and I'm 5'10", so I estimated it to be between 6.5 and 7 feet tall. There was heavy leaf litter on the ground, and you could see the impressions where he had ran, but there was too much clutter on the ground to get a print. And I looked over at Nick, and he said, "Tell me you got that on camera." And that's when I looked down, like, "Nope, never turned it on." Well, LBL is a fairly recent area. It's a national parks public use area. It's not a park. It's per se. It's a public use area. So therefore, it has never been monitored by the missing 411s. But the land between the lakes area was originally known as the land between the rivers. Those lakes were created in 1963 by the Tennessee Valley Authority to create a pair of hydroelectric dams. So prior to 1963, the area was just this area between two large rivers. There were lots of homesteads there. There were a lot of old cemeteries there. And in 1963, they basically just eminent domained literally everybody and kicked them out of the LBL. Just the government took the land and flooded those two valleys, and their homestead's still under the water. Where people had lived, including a few graveyards, from what I hear. But prior to that area being when it was known as the land between the rivers, it was an area that had already had a reputation for weird things. The earliest known European sightings in that area date back to the late 1600s from French trappers who came through the area. They referred to it as the loup-garou, which is the French word for werewolf. Prior to that, natives that lived in the area, which I believe were the Cherokee, the Chocktaw, and I want to say the Osage, all stretched through that area. They all referred to that area as cursed ground. Some of the stories were of a shaman that had gone dark, much like a skinwalker, who had been cursed to become this wolf creature. And in other stories that they talked about wolf type creatures that had haunted the area. But people have been disappearing there for a very long time. So at least the 1600s is when the sightings date back to. I know a lot of locals, a lot of people that live right around that area swear up and down that there's nothing going on there, but there are way too many stories coming out of there. And also, that city of Grand Rivers, they have a lot to lose by people being afraid of that area. They host huge fishing tournaments right there. How that city stays afloat is the tourist trade, and if people stop coming, they've got a vested interest in keeping people coming to that area. So I think that's a big reason why, at least in Grand Rivers, they don't want to talk about it. After a number of people disappeared in there, oddly enough, the Conservation Department and the National Park Service reintroduced wood bison and elk to LBL. There are herds of wood bison and elk in the area that you're not allowed to hunt. Why would you introduce large game species in an area and not allow people to hunt them?
What are they feeding?
I think that's exactly what they're doing. I think by reintroducing large game species, they figured whatever was there would have an alternate food source. Yet people still go missing in LBL all the time. Most of the time it gets shut up like fast. Once in a while you'll catch an article about it. Miss Naoma Finn from Naoma Finn Storyteller, her and I were researching a story out of that area. And before the article got pulled from the internet, because we were able to find the article and read it, it was an autopsy report from a newspaper article. I talked about the autopsy. Said the autopsy showed death by animals. There's no conspiracy, so don't ask. Literally, the article said that.
Okay, so bizarre.
Yeah, why would you throw that in the article? I've seen lots of articles about missing people. There's the story of the bow hunter who was killed. Basically, he was ripped out of his tent. His bow was found shattered, and they found what was left of his body about a mile back in the woods away from his house. That's not mountain lion behavior. Mountain lion can drag an animal. It really can. But, it's not going to drag a 220, 230 pound grown man miles back into the woods. It's going to find a place where it can get away from people and start eating it. Coyotes don't do that. Coyotes attack and kill their prey, and they will eat it right there. If you've ever come across a coyote kill, it's messy. There's pieces everywhere. You'll find bones. You'll find bits of flesh. You'll find hair. Coyotes are not clean. Don't leave a clean kill site. Wolves are similar. Wolves will eat their prey where they kill it. They won't drag it off. And none of these are supposed to really even be in LBL. They're not supposed to have any big predators other than supposedly bears. Never saw a bear while I was there. Never saw evidence of a bear. Doesn't mean they're not there. I just didn't see them. But bears don't generally do that either. A bear will bury its kill, like cover it with leaves and things like that to come back and feed on it later. But you don't hear about bears dragging their kill miles off into the woods. So whatever killed that bow hunter is still pretty mysterious. Of course, they said it was a pack of wild dogs, but you get a lot of that in that area. It was wild dogs. There was just outside of LBL, there was a 13-year-old kid who was killed in his own yard and dragged half a mile up a bluff side. And they said that was wild dogs. Dogs don't do that. Dogs ain't going to drag a good-sized kid up a bluff. It's not happening. Wild dogs like that will drag it to where it's easy to eat, not where not that much effort to get it. And that's something people don't really realize is there's something called conservation of effort. When large predators make a kill, they have to constantly evaluate things, because even small wounds out in the wild like that can be fatal if they get infected. So large predators will evaluate they'll do kind of a risk analysis in their head, and it's just a natural instinct. They'll look at it like, how much trouble is this going to be to kill? Is it going to put up a fight? Am I going to get hurt? Which is why you don't see a whole lot of times big predators attacking each other over kills. They'll put on displays and try to chase each other off, but every big predator knows that a serious wound is fatal. So you don't really see that as much. Mountain lions will chase off other mountain lions. I've seen mountain lions chase off coyotes. Mountain lions will kill coyotes if they can get a hold of them. But when it comes to fending each other off, they don't want to risk getting hurt. They want to keep the upper hand as much as possible, because they've got to expend energy to get that food, and the amount of food they get has to make up for the energy they expended to get it. Because it's not like they can pop down to Hardee's and grab a burger afterwards if they didn't get enough to eat. They've got to exist on what they kill. So if you've got a mountain lion that weighs 130, 140 pounds if it's a young one, and it sees a buffalo that weighs 12, 1,300 pounds, it might take a run at it, but the first time he gets thrown, it's done. It's like, no. But it'll go after a buffalo calf or a small kid. You can bet your hind end, though, they will definitely do that, because there's a minimal amount of risk. And that's why, you always heard stories about the wolves and predators going after the weakest in the herd. Because they're already hurt, they're already sick, they're already slower than the others, and 9 times out of 10 the herd would sacrifice them just to keep moving. So yeah, they tend to select targets based on what's easiest to kill. The guy with the bow hunter was armed. Very, very rare for something like that to attack and kill an armed person. There are lots of stories of hunters that have gone missing, and the missing 411 stories and things like that. There are lots of stories of armed hunters intimately familiar with the area they hunt, disappearing without a trace. And I kind of have a theory about that. I've talked to a lot of hunters myself over the years, probably 25, 30 guys from here in the Ozarks that said, yeah, I saw one from my deer stand, or I saw one from my deer blind, or I saw one from my porch, and I had my scope on it, but I didn't take the shot because I thought it was too human. I thought there's a chance if there's a chance at all that that's a person in a costume, I better not shoot him. He said he says it didn't look animal enough that we were comfortable taking the shot. I think the missing hunters took the shot.
That's, I think, an amazing theory. I really do.
I think they took the shot, and either it got them or the ones with it did. The stories of these things date back centuries, so we didn't have the technology to biologically create these things. There's just way too much, historical sightings for me to be comfortable with the they were created in a lab theory. And now I'm not saying that the government didn't get their hands on some and try to turn them into a weapon. I would not put that past our government in any way, shape, or form. But I don't think they created them. They certainly look for a way to exploit it, but I don't think they created it. And I also don't necessarily ascribe supernatural abilities to them, and I'll tell you why. And I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm not saying that my theory is the only theory. My theory is a theory. It's just that, if people can agree with it, disagree with it. Individual results may vary, but this is based on personal experience and anecdotal evidence that I've collected over the years is what kind of formed my opinion of these things. I think that they're a natural part of our environment, and I think they've been around for a long time. Take the uncanny valley theory. Psychological testing was done across people all across the globe. People all over the world who never had contact with each other all turned out to have an innate subconscious fear of something that looks almost like us in the dark. Like, for example, you turn off your light in your your bedroom, and that jacket that's hanging on a peg in the corner suddenly looks like a person, and you're like, crap, and you turn that light back on, and you realize, okay, it's just that jacket. But for that first few seconds, when you see a humanoid shape outline, everybody has that primitive fear, and it exists across humanity, no matter what continent of origin. All of humanity has that. And to me, that says that at some point in our evolutionary history, something that looked an awful lot like us hunted us in the dark. And I think it was these things. I think dogman and Bigfoot have been around since we have. And I think, there's numerous points throughout our history where we've been on the menu. For example, a great real-world example of how these things could exist and be right under our nose is, look how long it took Western science to accept the existence of the mountain gorilla. Local natives in the area in the Congo had been saying these things have been around for years and years. And of course, I always make the joke that the guys from the British Museum are like, no, that couldn't possibly exist. And then, somebody drags a body in and drops it on their desk. They're like, yes, there it is. I get to name it. I saw it first. It's how Western science has always worked. And the mountain gorilla is a great example of that. They kept saying, no, it's just native folklore. But then, one gets brought in. And that happened again recently. There were stories coming out of the Congo, and everybody's heard what they used to refer to as the killer ape theory. How Michael Crichton even used the killer ape theory in his book Congo, where these killer apes were killing people. That theory came from local native tribes that talked about a tribe of apes that would hunt and kill people. They referred to them as lion killers. And of course, Western science, again, doesn't matter if it's 1865 Britain or 1995 United States. Like, no, that's just native folklore. Killer apes don't exist. They're not aggressive. Blah blah blah. We don't believe these things exist. In 1999, National Geographic was in the Congo Basin looking for something else entirely, and they caught something on trail cam. They didn't know what it was. Turns out it's an area of the Congo referred to as the Billy area, B-I-L-I. What they captured on is now called the Billy ape. Anybody can Google this. These are basically, they look kind of like chimpanzees, only they spend most of their time walking bipedal, and they're about 6 feet tall. They're known to make war on other clans of apes. They use weapons, and it has been proven that they do hunt lions. They will get together in a group with spears, and they will kill and eat lions. They're also not afraid to go in the water. And they have been known to drag off the occasional villager or somebody that got out into the jungle and got lost. These things are extremely dangerous. And it threw the vegetarian, everything's copacetic ape theory right out the window, because the Billy apes are dangerous. Then they've been able to document those things actually making war on each other. They're very intelligent, and this is a real world cryptid. This is a large, aggressive, bipedal, meat-eating ape that nobody believed existed 20 years ago. But 25 years ago, because it was 1999. But National Geographic was actually able to get them on camera and start documenting these things. And now the Billy ape is the newest member of the giant ape species. It's our newest geologic descendant or whatever, but it's now recognized as a species. Which is terrifying. They said its closest living descendant or relative is the western lowland chimp. So these things have the aggressiveness of a chimp and the size of an ape, and they're real, dude. Look them up. I mean, Google Billy ape, B-I-L-I. The Billy ape is a real thing, and for all the people that say that no large primates exist anymore, that we've discovered them all, explain to me how then we didn't know about the Billy ape. We're still finding big stuff all the time. And as much as people don't want to admit it, we are not the masters of this planet. There are huge sections of this planet that we have not explored. If you go to Google Maps and look at North America and use the satellite view, not just the hand-drawn map view, use the satellite view from the North Pole to basically the southern tip of South America are massive sections of unbroken green. Yeah, there are roads that goes through some of these forests. There are the occasional town in some of these forests. But if you follow that map, there are massive, I mean, hundreds of millions of acres of unbroken green. In the United States alone, I mean, I want to say it's 88 million acres were set aside just for national parks. That's not state parks. That's not public use areas. That is just national parks. And that's another one of my more crazy harebrained theories that I don't think is really that far out there. One of the earliest known incidents we have on record of a Bigfoot killing somebody is called the Bowman incident. The Bowman incident was recorded in great detail in Teddy Roosevelt's book, The Wilderness Hunter. And that book was written before Teddy went into politics. Everybody knows Teddy was a big game hunter. Teddy explored the West. Teddy went to Africa on safaris. Teddy was a hunter. Teddy was a outdoorsman. There's a famous picture of Teddy Roosevelt riding a moose in a river. I mean, this dude, he was the real deal. When it comes to outdoorsman and conservation, he was truly the real deal. But what got me to thinking about the Bowman incident is I've been collecting stories from, hillbillies and people and deer hunters and people that live out in the woods all my life. But when I read the Bowman incident, what really compelled me was the sheer amount of details in it. You don't get that kind of details out of people that live out in the woods. They'll tell you, yeah, we set up camp in a little divide, and while we were in camp, we would hear things. You don't get how they built their lean-to, what kind of traps they used. The details in the Bowman incident were astounding. And to me, that really made me stop and think, how did he get this much detail? How did he know all of this? And then the other question popped into my head. Bowman's first name was never revealed, and he never came forward. Even when the book became successful, he never came forward and goes, yeah, that was my story. Since the other partner in the incident died, I think Bowman was Teddy Roosevelt. I think Teddy went trapping up in these mountains, and something killed his partner, and he didn't want to say it was a monster, and because he had political aspirations. He knew that saying, I was out in the woods and a monster killed my friend, they were going to think he was nuts or he did it, and that would be the end of his career. So I think Bowman was Teddy Roosevelt. And if you don't think that's a huge leap of faith, if you don't think that that's really not way out in Albuquerque somewhere, if you can accept that as at least a possibility that Teddy Roosevelt was Bowman, then flash forward to President Teddy Roosevelt. What's one of the first things he does? He created the National Park Service. He's the one that set those 88 million acres aside as preserved land for something. Yeah, he was conserving animals, but I honestly think a lot of that areas we're still not allowed access to.
If they came out and publicly declared that there are all these things going on, they would lose billions overnight, practically.
Oh yeah. Well, look what happened in Oregon when the spotted owl was put on the endangered list. It shut logging down in Oregon for a decade. Think of how much is going to be lost. And the national parks themselves, just off tourists, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
What do you know about the Martin Groves experience?
I've met Martin personally. Met him at a couple of different conventions. Former law enforcement, and Martin is a very credible source in my opinion. I would accept his account pretty much just as what it is. Now, lots of people will hear stories and make different conclusions based on these things, based on, even descriptions. No two people are going to interpret it the exact same way. So I don't necessarily agree with his assertions about it, but I don't disagree with them either. But as far as the account itself, I've got no problem 100% believing that happened to Martin. Just a really interesting, very compelling case. For them to be coming up on his campsite and following him in the woods, that sounds so much like things that have happened to people I know, and similar to some of the experiences I've had out in the woods as well. Not quite as dangerous as what happened to Martin, but I've had some very creepy experiences.
More so what happened at the end. I think for me, like one of the creepiest tie-ins was how at the beginning of the story, he had met that gentleman in the truck, or they were just having casual small talk. And I guess, long story short, and I'm saying this stuff for people who've never heard a story, that I guess they found this guy pulled out of his truck, that there was some violent physical altercation. And I don't know how far away Martin said they found his body, but apparently it had been eaten on. And by what? They're like, well, so I think upon hearing that account, when didn't they like come back the following day and there's all those like fishing game and like police, they're like, you need to leave now, like get out of here. Like don't talk about it, just go, nothing to see here, go. It's that's right, because he was a cop too. I remember that. Really, it's that kind of information you get that you're like, oh my gosh, it sours your stomach.
Is an interesting area. If you've followed a Dark Waters channel, Dark Waters has a fantastic channel. He's a great storyteller. He first presented a story called The Siege of Lockett Ranch, which if you hear that story, not only is it compelling, it's terrifying. It's about a family in the 1940s that were, after a year-long fight, were driven off their land by a pack of dogmen. Basically, their farm was destroyed by this pack of dogmen, and I really can't do the story justice without really going into a lot of detail. But you should really hear the Dark Water telling, because it's chilling. But that's not the only incident that's happened in Taylor, Mississippi. Lots of things. I spoke to a trucker one time who, near Taylor, Mississippi, pulled off on the side of the road for the night to get some sleep, and because he'd reached the end of his log, and truckers can only drive for so many hours before they have to shut it down. And as he was getting ready to get into his sleeper, he heard something scraping on the side of his truck, and he thought there was somebody out there messing with his truck. So he crawls back up and he's looking out the mirrors, and he doesn't see anything on either side of the truck. He said, but he was so concentrating on the mirrors, he didn't realize that there was something in the darkness next to the truck staring in his window. And he looked up, and out the passenger side, looking directly at him in the window, and we all know how high trucks set off the ground. Looking right in the window, he said, was what he described as a werewolf. He said it had weird golden colored eyes. He said it looked like a wolf, like a gray wolf, but it was upright. It was just staring at him. And I said, what'd you do? He goes, well, I grabbed my shotgun, and it ducked out of the line of sight. And as soon as it was away from where I could see it, I fired the engine up and got the hell out of there. He said, logbook be damned. I went several miles down the road and found another place to pull off where there were people. He said, I would not stop my truck anywhere near Taylor, Mississippi after that. If you go on YouTube, look up Taylor, Mississippi animal attacks, and you will find local news reports of numerous attacks on animals in that area. Donkeys, horses, cattle, large animals, not like dogs and chickens and sheep getting mauled. We're talking big animals, 12, 1,400 pound animals that are being attacked in this area. Also, there are a lot of reports around the Taylor, Mississippi area. That appears to be one of those areas like LBL that just has a lot of activity for some reason. There seems to be a lot of dogman activity in that area, and I think it's probably because of how thick the woods are.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but someone had mentioned that it's gotten to the point now, because like, you know, in this like paranormal circle of all of us, that the whole Taylor, Mississippi has kind of gotten out of the bag. So I guess like it's to the point now where if you go there and like cops see that you're out of state, they'll pull you over and be like, why are you here?
I've heard that. I have not been to Taylor personally, but I'm not too terribly worried about it. I mean, I don't really think that's going to be as big an issue. Now, I think if you go there respectfully and you don't go like, you know, digging through people's private property and stomping around and acting like an idiot, I think you're probably going to ignore you. If you went to Taylor and went to the local library and read like magazine articles and maybe drove some of the back roads and just didn't bother anybody, I would say you'd probably be fine. Now, I don't know. I haven't been there personally. It's one of the places that we are planning on going, hopefully this coming year, 2024. But I really think as long as you're not being, you know, running around like you're filming an episode of Finding Bigfoot, I think you're probably going to be fine. That's why I stopped giving a lot of the places that we go and look for things, a lot of the areas that we've researched. I've stopped giving exact locations. I give a general area, like I'll say part of the Mark Twain National Forest. That's almost 4 million acres. So, you know, there's a lot of Mark Twain. But because the problem is if you give a person's name or if you give an address, then you're going to get 25 people that will go out there and either one, bug them to try to get on their land, or two, just go on their land without asking. There's way too much. It's so crazy how people do that, because around here, that can get you shot. Just like the classic Romanian literature on werewolves, the loup garou is the French werewolf. It's the same werewolf story we all grew up with. It's just what the French call it. Like the Beast of Gévaudan, which was a werewolf creature that attacked and killed like 120 people in France in the Middle Ages. The French are very, very passionately believe in the werewolf. It's essentially the same classic werewolf story we all know and love, but it's just what the French call it. You know, if you ever looked up the story on the Beast of Gévaudan, that's a very interesting story, and it's documented by dozens of people, including members of the clergy, that there were people being hunted and killed by a werewolf in France in the Middle Ages, and it ended up killing like 120, 130 people. Werewolf Springs is an area in Tennessee. It's actually part of a park now, but originally that whole area was in private hands. And there are a number of stories of dogman type creature sightings in that area, but the most famous, I wish Miss Naoma from Naoma Finn Storyteller, I wish you should get a hold of her, because she is really researched Werewolf Springs. She knows that subject way better than I do. She is a fantastic researcher. That lady knows more about some of these places than just about anybody. If she's researched a subject, you can say it's been thoroughly researched. But what I was given to understand is in the late 1800s, there was a man and his manservant. Now, you can read manservant, or, considering it was the South in the 1800s, might not have been a willing relationship, we'll just call it that. But he had a manservant with him, and they were traveling by wagon near Werewolf Springs, and they kept hearing something following them in the woods. The horses were getting nervous, and this thing kept getting closer, and they didn't know what it was. And they would catch glimpses of this dark figure moving through the woods. Well, at some point, they decided, you know what? This thing is going to easily overtake this wagon. We should probably run. So they both jumped off the wagon and took off in opposite directions. Well, the landowner hid in the woods and heard this thing tearing his manservant apart. Heard it over the course of a good long time as it basically slaughtered this guy and ate him. He makes his way back to town, tells the story. They get a posse together, a large group of armed men, to go back out and look for this thing. And apparently they were tracking from the area where they found what was left of the body. And it was a cool evening. There was a light fog on the ground, and one of them saw it, and they opened fire. And in the confusion, while so many men were firing into the woods, when they finally called to stop and wanted to see if they'd gotten it, the creature was gone, and so were, I think, 3 members of the search party. Never found. So these guys were like, okay, this thing just took on a group of armed men and killed several of us. So they hired a big game hunter, a guy that, you know, had hunted supposedly everything you could hunt. So this guy's like, oh, I'll have this done in a day. He was very confident in his ability to hunt anything. So he gets his gear, he goes out to the area, and there was a cabin out there, and he sets up shop in this cabin and starts hunting this thing. And after a few days of him not finding it, it found him. It came after him in the cabin, busted its way inside, and he managed to avoid getting killed by crawling up in the rafters of the cabin and shooting down at this thing as it continued to attack him. As the sun started coming up, it broke off the attack and took off. So I'm assuming at that kind of range, he had to have hit that thing at least once, but it kept trying to kill him. It wasn't until the sun came up that it took off, and he got down, went back to town, was like, nope, I'm done. I'm not going after this thing anymore. But supposedly there's still sightings of this thing, and even in the area not far away has been reported a white dogman, completely white one. But that area is still known for disappearances. That area is still known for being a very creepy area, and the only way to get there is, I think it's about a 3-mile trail to actually get to the springs itself. And if you look at pictures of Werewolf Springs, it's a fairly innocuous looking place. It's not something that you would look at and go, okay, this is something terrifying. It just looks like a small body of water in the woods. I mean, it's just a very unassuming place, but the reputation for that area is very dark, and the sightings go back at least 100 years, maybe more. But when you get names like Werewolf Springs, if you take an old map, and you don't find them so much on Google Maps, but if you have old maps, especially topographical maps of areas, because I've got several, if you look at these maps of areas around you, you will find place names like Rattlesnake Springs or Booger Canyon. The devil. One of my favorites is there's a place called the Devil's Kitchen not far from here. Why did they get names like that? Why did they get names like Werewolf Springs? Who looked at that and goes, oh, this place looks like a great place to build a cabin. I'm going to call it Werewolf Springs. These places got named that for a reason. And if you look back in some of the old newspaper articles from the 1800s, you will see lots of Wolfman or wild man stories. And wild man, I believe, is what they called Bigfoot, because the term Bigfoot didn't come around until 1957, and dogman didn't become popular use until the late 90s. So before that, they just called it what they thought it was, a wolf man or a werewolf or a wolf creature or a wild man or a hairy man, things like that. And if you look at Native American tribes, every tribe's got its own name for Bigfoot. They describe a similar creature, and some of them talk about them being peaceful, and others not so much. Others talk about them, hunting and eating people or carrying people off from their villages. So, I think not only the region we're from affects their temperament, but I think the type of environment affects their temperament. For example, a great example is bears. You get down here in the southern United States, you've got plenty of black bears. And if you look at black bears from the east and west coast to the black bears that range here in the Midwest, there are differences. There are regional differences in the bears. The ones on the East Coast tend to be a bit more aggressive than the ones here in the Midwest and the ones out on the West Coast. But black bears can and will get aggressive. But they're primarily omnivores. They'll eat roots and berries, and they're not against eating meat. I mean, if something presents itself, or they find a kill or find something that had died, they will eat it. Black bears will be carnivorous, but they're more omnivorous as a general rule. They're constantly browsing just about anything they can eat. Go a little farther north, in colder and more rugged climates, you have grizzly bears. Grizzly bears' diet consists far more of meat, although they are still omnivorous to a degree. They will eat roots and berries and bark and grubs and all kinds of things, but they will primarily eat meat. They're a much bigger animal than a black bear. They require a much heavier diet, and there are regional variances in grizzly bears. Coastal brown bears in Alaska are very different from interior brown bears. Kodiaks, which are a member of the brown bear family, are the largest member of the known brown bear family, are much bigger and more aggressive. Grizzlies are brown bears. So you've got multiple types of brown bears, and each one of them have their own unique characteristics. Get a little farther north, you run into polar bears. Polar bears are the biggest, and polar bears are carnivores. Polar bears don't eat fruits and berries. They eat slow natives. Anything they can catch. They eat seals. They eat fish. They'll eat other bears. And they are confirmed man-eaters. They will hunt and kill people. So I don't see anything could be any different with Bigfoot. I mean, depending on its climate, if the food is plentiful, you're going to find these things are going to be a lot more agrarian. They're going to be like black bears. They're going to eat roots and berries and grubs and things that they can easily find because it's readily accessible. Why risk an engagement with something when you've got food all around you? Again, not saying there won't be opportunistic. If they get a chance to kill a deer easily, or they find a deer, or in my case, when I had a deer just simply go missing after I shot it, they are opportunistic. They will take meat if they can get it. You get into more northern climates where plant life is the growth cycle of edible plants is different. You're going to see a lot more carnivorous behavior. That's why I think the colder the climate, the more aggressive these things are. That's why you get stories like the Janoskwa and the Gugway, because these are cold weather creatures that are confirmed man-eaters. So I think, much like bears, I think bears is a great example. I think much like bears, where they are at geographically and their type of environment certainly affects their behavior. And I think that is also shown in areas like LBL and Werewolf Springs and Taylor, Mississippi, where the game that they used to hunt might not be as plentiful as it once was, because these are areas with people. They now have competition for some of this big game, and I think that's why LBL reintroduced wood bison and elk to give these things something to eat. Now, around Taylor, Mississippi, there are lots of people that deer hunt. I know a lot of people in the South. I know a lot of people in the Midwest supplement their diets with venison. I grew up eating venison. I mean, growing up, there wasn't a time we didn't have at least a significant quantity of venison in our deep freeze. Venison is good. It's a very lean form of meat. You got to be a little careful today now with chronic wasting disease, but they make test kits for that, so you can still be safe. But a lot more people, a lot more hunting, a lot more competition for the food. So we're starting to see hunters going up against these things, and I think that explains a big chunk of our missing people. Like the joke I've made before. Let's say you've got an area like up in Alaska. You've got a big bear, big grizzly, and it's close to hibernation time, and he's getting a little old, not as fast as he used to be. And he steps out of the woods, and to his left, he sees a deer. And the deer is running about 40 miles an hour down that trail. And he looks to his right, and he sees a guy in hiking shorts and wearing a pair of Birkenstocks, bipping along, not paying any attention to anything. Which one's going to be easier to catch?
Yeah, I don't take 2 and 2 to figure that out.
Yeah, and I think it's the same thing with Bigfoot. I don't think they're actively hunting us per se, but in some places like up in Alaska and in parts of Canada, I think that may be true. I think they may actively hunt people, just like bears do. But I think at least down here in the lower 48, I think if they've got an opportunity to take a human, they will. But I don't think we're the staple of their diet.
One thing that's always been fascinating to me is, I won't say the concept of it, but the stories you hear about Bigfoot taking women and children. In fact, I can't remember the tribe, but there's a supposed legend. Well, if you talk to a lot of natives in Northern California, it's not a legend to them. It's very true. I can't remember the mountain, but anyway, they would call these beings mountain devils because apparently at night they would raid these villages and like kidnap these women and children and eat them, like full on cannibalize and devour them. So it's no secret that there's a lot of there's a lot of war going on between natives and these beings of all different tribes.
Well, the Chocktaw Bigfoot incident is also called the Lafleur County War. There was a captain, and that is confirmed historically that this man did exist. His name was Joshua Lafleur, and in this story where he was killed, if you look the man up, he died in the right time period. So there are historical indications that this story at least has roots in truth. It's impossible to say if this story is 100% true, but it's that's impossible to say with anything. But this story at least rings true with me, if you know what I mean. Apparently, there was the Chocktaw in Lafleur County were having issues with people going missing, children, women, even lone braves, and they started digging into it. Well, there was Joshua Lafleur led a military unit, and part of his unit were made up of Chocktaw. They were the brothers were known as the Tubby Brothers, Tubbee, and these guys were known to be huge guys, like pushing 7 feet tall. They were massive, which is not uncommon. If you look up the history of the Osage, in the mid 1880s, the Osage Indians were reported to be between 6.5 and 7 feet tall. So there is precedent for Native Americans to be this big, even though it wasn't common. These guys were so large they had to ride draft horses. They couldn't ride a regular riding horse. Well, they went looking for what was making these people disappear. And they finally rode upon a camp of what they described as huge, hairy beasts. The descriptions, they described Bigfoot, and they said the stench was overwhelming. There were piles of bodies that they'd been feeding on, and so they attacked. And Joshua Lafleur, the leader, their captain, was actually killed during this fight. But they ended up at least killing most of the tribe of these creatures, and then driving the rest off. And the ones they killed, they stacked up and burned along with the bodies of the victims. The Chocktaw, that's known as the Chocktaw Bigfoot War or the Lafleur County War. But there seems to be some historical precedent for this to have actually happened. And I think we've come pretty close to finding the exact spot. Doc and Robbie and I are wanting to make a trip down to the Chocktaw Mountains of Oklahoma, because I think I've got this narrowed down to a fairly small area, and it would be really cool if we could find at least artifacts or bones. But supposedly they piled them up and lit them on fire and then left the area. But these things were powerful enough that they were like knocking horses over as they charged in, because these guys were considered light cavalry. So the story itself is very compelling. We did an entire show on it where we went into much greater detail. But this is a story that's been told and retold of an actual siege of a war that was fought because these things were hunting and killing people. The Chocktaw also have another story of Bigfoot and dogmen going to war with each other over resources, over food, which that's popped up in a few other places too. There's some stories from the Native Americans down in northern Georgia, Oklahoma, and even out in Wyoming, where clans of creatures have gone to war over resources, over thinning resources, and eventually one of the groups would have to move on to find other hunting grounds. But there's precedent for this. It's not unheard of. It's something that I think, if you read the story of the Tubby brothers and Josh Lafleur, I think you're going to find the story at least very compelling. Again, it happened in the 1800s, so there's really no way to prove that it happened. But we know Josh Lafleur and the Tubby brothers were real people. We know from the date of the story that lines up exactly with when Lafleur died. In fact, Lafleur County is named after him. But I honestly believe that event happened, and I'm hopefully we can locate the spot where it did. Hanabe, Oklahoma is a small town down in southeastern Oklahoma. Not a very big place, And I won't say the name of the families, although I do personally know one of the people that were involved. I won't mention his name because he's told and retold the story, and he's taken a lot of heat for the story over the years, and now he's just done with it. He doesn't want to get asked about it. I tried to get him to let me write a book based on his telling. And he's like, if you want to write it, you just go crazy, but I don't want to get dragged into the mud anymore about this story. He says it happened. I told you what happened, and I don't want to do it anymore. And I get that. His family's taken a lot of grief over the years for this, but this family lived on a farm outside of Hanabe, and much like a lot of rural families, they supplemented their groceries with animals, with deer, and they did a lot of deer hunting. They had an unattached shed out next to the house where they would not only butcher deer that they'd killed, but they put them in the deep freeze out there, and when they needed meat, they brought it in the house. Well, they first noticed that some of the meat started going missing, and they thought, okay, well, somebody's messing with us. Somebody's coming down here and stealing deer meat, which to them, was kind of a slap in the face, because these are the kind of guys that if you'd have said, hey, we're having kind of a hard time right now, they'd probably sent you home with a bag of groceries. They didn't have a whole lot, but they were willing to share what they had. And I know a lot of country folks like that. I mean, they'll give you the shirt off their back. And these guys were no different. So for one of their neighbors to steal from them was kind of an unheard of thing, because everybody kind of down there kind of looked out for one another. So they're thinking it's got to be somebody else coming in. We don't know who's stealing the deer meat. So they put a deadbolt and a padlock on the shed, and it ripped the door off and went in and got the deer anyway. And they're like, okay, this isn't the person. Nobody pulls a door off like that. They might break the lock. They might smash the door in, but nobody pulls a door off and goes in after the meat. So at this point, they're like, what the hell is out here? So wasn't long after that, they decided, you know what, screw it. They just brought the deep freeze in the house. They said, if it's going to come in the house to get food, it's going to get shot. Because these guys were well armed and they hunted a lot, so they had the resources to defend their house. So they brought the meat in the house, and then they started noticing like tapping on the windows and footsteps on the porch, and their kids were seeing something outside their window at night. So they're getting pretty nervous. And then one night, not too long after that, one of the brothers, their sister was coming to visit with her kids, and she stopped at the gate to get out of her car to open the gate so she could drive through. And there were more than, I believe it was 3 of the creatures were like approaching her at her car, and she threw the gate open, jumped back in the car, and drove up to the house hitting her horn. And that was the first time that they really felt like these things were coming after them. Then things started getting hairy. They started trying to get in the house. They started, slamming the side of the house. They started, harassing them because they wanted that deer meat. And it's one of the things we tell people here in Missouri about feeding wild animals. Once wild animals start associating you with food, you're not going to get rid of them. That's why they tell people all the time, don't feed bears. Don't feed black bears, because if you don't feed them, they'll smash their way into your house to look for food. Last thing you want is these things to associate your home with food, because then they get pissed off when that food source isn't there anymore. And that's kind of what happened. That's why I always tell people, don't what they call habituate, or don't gift these things, because when you stop, they may not want you to stop. Or, God forbid, if you're taking food out in the woods and putting it on a tree stump and leaving food for these things, and these things get used to people coming out there and leaving food on this tree stump, and then the next thing you know, some guy goes hiking by that knows nothing about it, and you've got the Lord of the Rings situation. Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys. But these things started like smacking the side of the house, getting more and more aggressive, to the point that these guys called I'm not going to name the organization by name. If you look up Siege of Hanabe, you'll be able to read their details, because the account exists in a lot of places. And I'm not going to throw shade at any organization, but they contacted an organization who sent people out to assist, supposedly to look into the Bigfoot on the area. And while this organization was there, these things came out of the woodwork and were coming after the house, to the point that these guys were like, "Nope, we're done," and got in their vehicle and left. So they were no help. So as these things were like coming up, trying to get in the house, these brothers decided, you know what? All right, we're done with this, and they started shooting. And it turned into like a night-long siege. It got to the point where they sent their children, and because they shared the farm, they sent their children and their wives away, so they could try to drive these things off their land. And it wasn't working. They shot numerous creatures that were trying to get in the house, and even at one point saw one go down with a shot to the belly, and another one crawled out of a ravine and dragged it off. The story is really intense, because they fought hard to try to keep that land. They ended up abandoning the house for months, and once these things got established that the deer weren't around anymore, the food wasn't around anymore, they stopped coming around. But supposedly that area around Hanabe is still extremely active. In fact, they have a huge Bigfoot festival down there every year. It's like a 4 or 5 day event with a campground and everything. We've been wanting to do the Hanabe Bigfoot festival for a while. I hope we can do it before long. But there's enough activity down there that it still attracts investigators even today. In fact, a couple of guys I know, local guys, that from up here in the Ozarks, just spent a couple weeks down in the Kiamichi Mountains, which is right there near Hanabe. Apparently, the ones in Oklahoma are pretty aggressive. I've heard quite a few dogman accounts, but the dogman accounts don't seem to be in that same area. That area down in southeastern Oklahoma, down near Durant. Down around Durant, Oklahoma, seems to be primarily Bigfoot sightings. The dogman sightings seem to become more toward the center of the state, Lake Oologah area, and in some cases near Broken Bow. But the Lake Oologah area seems to be more of the dogman area, and these are some pretty woolly areas. I mean, when people think of Oklahoma, they don't really realize how much wilderness is still out there. There's a lot of preserved land out there with thick forest and dense deep rivers, and there's just a lot of habitat out there for these things. And anytime you've got a combination of food source, habitat, and places that they can easily find a place to live, you've got those three big things. You've got shelter, food, and water. Right there in an area, you're going to find these things, and I don't necessarily think. In a lot of cases, people seem to think that anytime you get in a section of woods where there's more than 4 trees, there's a Bigfoot out there, and I don't think that's the case. I've been in lots of pretty heavily wooded areas that just didn't support it. There's not enough water around, not enough shelter around, not enough animals around. Lots of places I've gone to try to deer hunt and only found like squirrels or turkey. And while things can live on that, you get a very big animal, much less a family group of big animals, they're going to need a lot more protein. So these things tend to stick close to major water sources, and places where they've got shelter, food, water. These are the biggest factors when you want to find a research area. Does it meet the requirements? Now, that's not saying they don't pass through other areas. I think both Bigfoot and Dogman, I think they have a range. I don't think they migrate like geese or birds. I think they've got more of a range, like a mountain lion. A mountain lion, an adult mountain lion, has almost a 200-mile range that they will basically orbit this range. That's what they hunt in, and that's a mountain lion. Imagine how big the range for something the size of a Bigfoot would have to be, especially if it's a family group. That's why some areas have sightings, I believe. And if you look at the sighting reports, you'll find areas like, for example, Missouri. You'll find areas up around Hannibal and in parts of northern Missouri. You'll find them, in midsummer. You get down here in the more southern parts of the Ozark where there's less agriculture going on. Down here in the southern Ozarks, you're going to see them more active in the winter months and the fall, and that's because they're following the food. They're going to go where the food is. So I don't think these things are migrating. I think they have a range, and I think once you've been able to successfully predict the range, you can start predicting what times of the year they're going to be somewhere.
Nobody really talks about that, but yet in almost every account, I mean not every account, but in a lot of accounts that involve dogman Bigfoot, there's so many that talk about them stealing food, stealing deer, eating, roadkill. I mean, so like I feel like at this point, all of us can agree, yes, we've all seen and heard stories of these things physically needing to eat and eating food. But I never would have thought of them following game in that way, and just like regular predatory animals do. They're like, oh, like we're here these months because this is where our food is. And that makes
That's what the Native Americans did before white settlers forced them on the reservations. That's what the natives did. They followed the herds. And one of the reasons I don't ascribe a lot of personal theory to the more what they refer to as the woo, or the more supernatural elements, because if these things were able to walk through dimensions, or disappear from one spot and reappear in another spot, giving the history of Native American encounters and even early settlers encounters of these things attacking and killing people, if they were able to do that, there would be no stopping them. Nothing we did would stop them from hunting us. They could walk into your living room and take you and walk back out, and there'd be nothing you could do to stop it. I think they're flesh and blood creatures, and they have limitations. And in a lot of cases, they'll say, how come people have shot them multiple times and they didn't die? Number one, you wouldn't take a .22 caliber rifle to hunt an elk. You just wouldn't do it. You might be able to kill an elk if you got a lucky shot, or you were able to get multiple shots. You might be able to take down an elk with a .22 or a .22 Magnum, but you're going to take a much bigger rifle. It's because when you compare an elk to a deer, the bones are thicker, the muscles are thicker. The internal organs are set behind much more dense muscle mass. So it's harder to hit a heart of an elk than it is a mule deer or a white-tailed deer. So you would definitely need to use a bigger caliber. If you look how many times humans have survived getting shot multiple times, and then you basically upscale one of us to 3-4 times our body mass, where the muscles and the bones are much thicker, small calibers probably aren't doing that much damage. Not even penetrating.
What do you think about the idea that there are spiritual laws and rules that these entities have to follow, which is why they can't just teleport in your room and kill you?
I don't know. I mean, that's an explanation for why they can't. But to me, I've always said you can't explain a mystery with another mystery. When I was a cop, if we went to do a well-being check and we found the house was completely locked up, no broken windows, no forced entry, but we could look through the window and see a guy was sitting in his living room dead, we didn't immediately go, nope, something must have teleported in and killed him. You start looking for explanations, and generally Occam's razor applies. The most likely explanation is the simplest. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying that these creatures aren't supernatural or can't do these things, but I'm saying it is far more logical that they're just very adept at doing things we can't explain. Robbie, one of my co-hosts, for example, Robbie has gone to great length to explain how tracks work. Robbie's a tracker. He tracks people for his department. And people have said for years and years, well, I was following a set of Bigfoot tracks and they just went into the middle of the field and disappeared. So they must have gone into another dimension. No, not necessarily. Our own special forces are taught how to backtrack on their own tracks. Bears backtrack on their own tracks. Rabbits will backtrack on their own tracks to throw hunters off. So it's not unheard of for animals in the animal kingdom to backtrack, walk backwards in their own steps, and find rocky outcroppings or trees that they can grab a hold of to throw the trail off. And they might go 50, 100, they might go a long distance backwards before they throw you off. So just because you couldn't backtrack and find where they branched off does not necessarily mean they didn't throw you. And Robbie was able to identify things about tracks that I didn't even know. And I always fancied myself a pretty good tracker. I've learned to follow animals when I've gone hunting. Robbie pointed out that what they call pressure ridges. When you're walking, when you put your foot down, when you rock forward on your toes, the pressure ridge goes from back to front. He said, but when someone walks backwards on their tracks, they're putting their toes down and going backwards. He said, you can see the differences in the pressure ridges if you know what you're looking for. That's not something that you or I would know to look for. That's not, even if we grew up hunting, we knew what tracks looked like and how to follow them. That's not something that I was ever taught to do. That is not something that even entered into my field of equation. I couldn't tell by looking at a track which direction they were going. I always assumed the toes are pointing forward, that's the direction they're going. So there are a lot of details about tracking that most people who aren't trained trackers will never know. And that's one of the details we've talked about. Another detail we've talked about is how numerous investigators, including Doug Hycheck from Monster Quest, have discovered hair samples with a clear hair shaft. Now, this becomes very important because a clear hair shaft acts very much like a fiber optic cable. Fiber optics are being used in the next generation of ghillie suits because they absorb and redirect the color of light around them. Now, if this is a natural adaptation to these things, which we are finding more and more hair samples with these clear hair shafts, then we look at what M.K. Davis did of the breakdown of the Paul Freeman footage. M.K. Davis broke down a section, and I've watched the video. He was on our show and broke it down for us. Paul Freeman was tracking a large black male Sasquatch, and when it realized he was following it, he had seen it, it stopped in front of a large evergreen tree. And when it stopped, it went completely immobile and it disappeared right before your eyes. Just completely gone. He's like, where did it go? So he keeps going closer to this tree the whole time he's filming. He's like, I don't know where that thing went. Where did it go? He was right there. And when it realizes he's still coming, it starts walking again. And as soon as it takes a step, you can see it again. It didn't go into another dimension. It didn't walk through a portal. It simply went stock still. And the ambient light around it hit it.
Yeah, honestly, that's what makes this field so fascinating, is because I think if we were to divide this whole field into factions, it's either strictly paranormal or strictly physical. And it seems like both sides always have this like conflict where it's like, okay, well, how about this? And how do you explain this? And to me, it's just, the back and forth is so interesting. One thing I think that's also very fascinating is, obviously we're all grasping at straws here because none of us have the answer. So we're all of us. I don't care if anyone's like, well, I know for a fact. We're all just projecting our own theories based on like the stories we hear. So we'll probably never know for sure. But it's interesting to me that you have so much evidence and so many stories like what you're telling me that strongly support there is like flesh and blood aspects to these things, and that like, yeah, they're not teleporting people's houses and killing them, and they're getting shot, that they're dying. How many stories we heard of this guy killed a Bigfoot, he killed a dogman, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's also so many where it's like people have seen these things coming out of portals, or you have like Skinwalker Ranch, where a couple stories where people recall seeing things come out. So it's like people ask me that too, just being who I am. They'll constantly email me, what do you think? I don't know. I don't know. It's like the more I do this, the more I believe that there's elements of both. But as far as like what the overall answer is, I don't know.
We as humans will always attempt to try to explain things. And if it's something we can't explain, we'll grasp at straws to try to find something that makes logical sense to us. Like, for example, the Freeman footage. When that thing just disappears, if somebody was in the woods and they saw this thing stop in front of a tree and it just disappeared, I could see how they would go, it must have just cloaked, or it went into a portal. I can totally get that. If things happen to you that are totally outside of your experience, you will look for ways to make it make sense to you. And I'm not saying that these people are wrong. They could be 100% correct, but you get two people that are one is a trained observer and the other is not. They're going to come to very different conclusions. They're no experts in this field. All we have is theory, and anybody that claims they're an expert is lying to you. So there really are no experts. All we have is our best theories, and that's all we really try to do, is try to find the most logical explanation for why some of these things are happening. And as a cop, I can't just jump to, I can't go from point A to point Z. I've got to go from A to B to C to D. I've got to eliminate things along the way. It's just the way my brain is wired. And I'm not saying that it's not, like you're saying, a supernatural cause or them being able to slip out of this dimension or something like that. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that there are other far more probable explanations when you examine the evidence. And I won't dispute what they saw. I'm not going to say, no, you didn't see that. That's what they saw. That's their experience. I was not there. Now, when you say, okay, did it just like step out? They're like, yeah. And then you explain to them about the silver hair, the clear hair shafts. Said, could it have been that you just didn't see it, and when you got too close, it started walking and you saw it? I don't know, maybe. Yeah. But there's no other animal in the animal kingdom that we've ever encountered that goes through portals or turns invisible. Now, granted, you've got cuttlefish and chameleons that can adapt to they have what's called adaptive camouflage. But I think that clear hair shaft is just another example of adaptive camouflage.
What do you think about this kind of like what I've heard ties everything, and where they say that these things, it's all supernatural. They come into our world, but when they come into our world, they end up adapting physical third density characteristics, like, needing to eat flesh and blood. But the issue with that is in terms of, okay, well, like, how long do they have to be here? Why can't they just go in and out at their own whim? Obviously, we don't know those things. It's a very interesting theory. But again, it just comes down to like, okay, well, yeah, that would explain it, but we don't know, man.
It is an interesting theory, and you're right. We don't know, but things like that, they're not even really working theories. They're not scientific theories because there's no way to disprove it. It's like, it's like saying, well, they just turn to ghost form and disappear. You can't disprove that, but there is no way they can prove it either. While again, I'm not saying that we have all the answers. We're just looking for rational, scientifically plausible explanations. Now, if it turns out that's not the case, yeah, I'm right there with you. We're going to the next level. We're looking for what else it can do, but I'm still not convinced we're not seeing adaptive camouflage and backtracking on its tracks. Another thing I believe is I think that not all, but I think some of what we refer to as tree knocks are made with their mouth. I think they do it with their, and I don't know if the noise filter on my microphone will pop it out on you. But as a kid, and I grew up on a farm in rural Missouri, I would mimic sounds. Just that, you grew up on a farm. There's no TV in the 70s, so I was outside I would mimic bird calls. I'd do whippoorwill sounds, and I would mimic sounds. Well, one sound I kept hearing from the woods behind our house was this popping sound, and to me it didn't sound like wood. It sounded like something was making this popping sound, and I kept trying different things. I'd do that, and no, that's not it, and do you pop your mouth like that. Like, no, that's not it. I'd try popping my hand. That wasn't it. So I started using the tip of my tongue on the roof of my mouth. And again, I don't know if my sound filter is going to block this out, but when you go out in the woods with me sometime, you hear how loud I can make this sound. I put the tip of my tongue against the roof of my mouth just behind my teeth, and then I pull it backwards. And the sound I make is very, very loud. But I tell you, when you're out in the woods, you can ask Doc and you can ask Robbie. When I pop my tongue, it carries. and I am by no means, got the lung volume or the lung capacity of 1,000-pound primate, and I can put my hands up like that, and you will hear it echo. We did it while I did it from the balcony of the cabin we rented up in the Smoky Mountains for our 30th anniversary. My wife and I went and stayed a week in a cabin up in the Smokies, and I went out on the deck right at evening, and I popped my tongue in groups of 3 several times, and didn't get a response. I was kind of hoping I would, but I didn't. But that night, my wife and I, the cabin was in 2 levels. The actual bedroom and shower and master bathroom were downstairs by themselves with the hot tub on a smaller deck, because it was built right on the side of a mountain. And the upper part was where the living room and kitchen was. And I made that noise from the upper balcony. The lower balcony was much closer to ground level. In fact, just outside the bathroom window was the ground, but it was pretty sloped. It was probably a 45-degree angle. So they built this cabin right in the side of this bluff. Beautiful cabin. We loved staying there. Well, the night that I'd been popping my tongue out on the deck, we went downstairs to go to bed, and I was laying in bed and I was reading, and Annette got up to go to the bathroom, and she goes, "Huh, that's weird." I'm like, "What?" She goes, "Must have been a bear." I'm like, "What do you mean?" She goes, "I just heard something outside the window grunt at me." She goes, "As I came up to the window, it grunted a couple of times." I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's probably a bear." So we don't think any more of it. She comes back to bed and crawls in bed, and I was getting to the point where I was just dozing off. And on that side of the cabin where the bathroom is, we hear wham, wham, wham. Something hit the side of the cabin 3 times, hard enough that we could feel it shake. So I grabbed my flashlight and a pew, and I ran upstairs so I could look down the windows on that side of the house, because there was no windows on that side of the lower end. That's where the bathroom was. So I go, I'm shining my light and I'm looking around. I go out on the deck and I look around. I can't find anything. There's nothing out there. But something definitely struck the side of that cabin hard. So I go back downstairs. I'm like, "I don't see anything. I don't know what the heck it was." She goes, "Well, maybe a bear did it." And so I agreed with her, just, so for sake of keeping her calm. But bears don't do that. Bears don't strike the side of a cabin. But we weren't the only cabin on that mountainside. There were some other cabins a little ways down. So I wasn't willing to just say, it had to have been, a Bigfoot. I'm willing to think, it's possible it could have been somebody from another camp, another cabin messing with us, or could have been, even, I guess, remotely possible, it could have been a bear. So I blow it off. Next morning, I get up, and I was getting up like right at the crack of dawn so I could watch the sunrise over the mountains. And I go out on the deck, and I've got my cup of coffee, and I would walk around the whole deck just looking around. And I got to the far left side of the deck where the barbecue grill was at, and I looked down. I'm like, "That's weird." So I pushed this tree branch back and looked down. And then I called my wife. I'm like, "Honey, come here and look at this." She goes, "What?" I'm like, "I'm not going to tell you what I'm seeing here. I want you to come look at it." So she comes over, and I've still got the branch look back. She goes, "Is that a footprint?" I said, "Yeah." She goes, like a person, like a footprint down there on the side in the grass. I said, "Yeah, that is a footprint." And even from up there, I was like 30 feet above it. I could tell it was huge. And I could send you pictures of it. So I take pictures from there with my cell phone. I zoom in as much as I can, and then I go out, and because it's like a 45-degree angle, I have to kind of make my way down to where that print is at. There were several partials, but one just absolutely beautiful print. So I get my Canon, my DSLR out, and I'm taking as close pictures as I can. Turns out this is rocky soil. It was 1.5 inches deep and 21.5 inches long, and you could see the toes and the arch in the print. It was not a double step from a bear, because a double step from a bear, you'll see the second set of toes and claws if you look. There were no claws on this. And on a bear print, the toes on a bear print, the middle toes are farther forward than the outer toes. This was shaped like our foot, like the big toe was the farthest forward. Then they kind of arced over toward the smallest toe. This looked like a very, very big bare human track. So I've taken a bunch of pictures of it. I've got a couple of things in the pictures for scale, and I told my wife, I said, I didn't bring anything to cast a track, and to this date, it is still the best track I've ever found. She goes, well, can you run into Walmart and get some plaster of Paris? And again, it was on a 45-degree angle. I'm like, I don't know if I can build something to cast this track, but I know I'm going to try and figure it out. So I go in the house, and I was still wearing like pajama pants and a t-shirt. So I go in the house, finish my coffee, and start to get dressed, and it starts raining. And it poured down for a day and a half. And when I say raining, it came down hard. I'm like, well, that track's gone. There's no way I'm getting that, but I've got a bunch of really good pictures from multiple angles. Well, you mentioned the Superstition Mountains and the headless bodies. One of my favorite stories that you did, was on the Hanabe Valley, and how people would go up into the Hanabe Valley and they would either find nothing or they would find the bodies with no heads. And this has been going on for a long time. What a lot of people don't realize is that the same thing has been going on in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. There's a valley that people go to where when they find the bodies, they find them missing heads. And here's the weird part, is the Superstitions are at the southern end of the Rocky Range. They're not really part of the Rocky Mountains, but they're right there with the Rockies. Okay. The Hanabe Valley is on the northern end of the Rocky Range. So they're part of the same mountain range, essentially. They're part of that same, geologic uprising. One of the interesting things about the Hanabe Valley is the local Indian tribe is referred to as the Dene. And that a lot of their oral traditions and what tell us about whatever lives in that valley is taken heads. Superstition Mountains are in Arizona, in Arizona, and New Mexico and Arizona is the home range of the Navajo. And if you're familiar at all with the Navajo's word for themselves is Dene.
That's so wild.
Really odd that it's happening with two tribes that refer to themselves as the Dene, with bodies that are turning up with heads missing attached to the mountains.
Yeah, the Headless Valley case is wild. It's definitely been a minute since I've covered that, but what's wild to me is that stories like that go back hundreds of years. And in fact, a lot of the local tribes there, it freaks them out. They won't touch it. And if you talk to them, they all believe that there's some sort of, I don't know if it's an entity or if it's a group of entities. Something is killing people and taking their heads for whatever reason. Obviously, anybody out there who wants to actually look into the details of the story, there's several accounts of multiple men being found who had gone in to look for gold, and then they would just be found headless for no reason. Obviously, the heads were never found. And then there's some other stories along with that where they would just have strange experiences, strange sounds. I can't recall any stories specifically of someone running into an actual creature of some kind that I can remember. But there's definitely enough stories there that would definitely point things in the direction of okay, just like with the LBL, the natives were hey, there's weird stuff going on here, be careful. And we're nah, we're gonna go get gold. And sure enough, we start dying, And they're dude, we told you, what are you doing? Interestingly enough, a lot of similarities are happening also up in Alaska with what a lot of the Inuit people talk about, the Kushtaka.
The hairy man.
Yeah, I can't say that, people are being found dead and without their heads, but obviously a lot of us are probably familiar with the Alaskan Triangle and how there's an ungodly amount of people who've gone missing up there. I'm not saying
in the last 30 years, it's 65,000 people have gone missing in that one small area.
Yeah, I'm not saying the Kushtaka is responsible, but I'm just saying there's a lot of weird stuff happening in that area of the world. Anomalies, I guess, is the term I like to use, because obviously, you're having a lot of people going missing. Obviously, people are going missing for legitimate reasons. So they get lost. They get attacked by grizzly bears, sure. But then you hear the weird ones where it's people are I was just talking to him and he vanished or he's just gone. How does that happen? What happens?
Right.
So it's people ask me that kind of stuff all the time. What do you think? I don't know, man. you talk to some of the natives, they got stories, right? Just kind of like with any other area of the world or the United States. They're like, hey, listen, we've been in this area a very long time. There's certain areas you just don't go. Either that this is like it's things hunting ground, or this is their territory, or this is a cursed area. You just don't do it. And of course, what do? We kind of, you don't know what you're talking about. And,
right.
you know, we've done that ever since we came over here. Blew them off. Right. And they're just like, dude, like we try to tell you. And like they're still to this day. I've gotten messages from I don't know if any direct Inuits people who like lived up there, but people who have like family relationships with tribes and stuff up there, or like, hey, I'm half, or like, you know, I'm descended of, and they all still very much have like stories and things they do and they don't do. It's very much a reality. So it really makes me wonder how much of that is a reality for like what we live in, like how much of that has like affected all the missing people in that area. You just don't know. If you're looking for stories, a lot of these tribes, I think almost all of them, they all have just tons of stories, but like you're saying, they keep it in-house, and they don't like to, they also don't like people digging around for it. You know, I've heard of stories where people are like, I'm a paranormal researcher and I went to this tribe and I'd asked the leader. They don't really like, they don't like that. And I've heard like, you're lucky if they're like, okay, like we'll tell you, because that's kind of like coveted knowledge. You know what I mean? Like that's like
you're lucky if they'll even talk to you.
Yeah, a lot of times, like I didn't want to entertain it. A lot of the native tribes are under the belief that even if you like start talking about it, you're just going to draw attention to yourself. And I know a lot of people immediately think of, you know, Skinwalker, but that's not exclusive to that. It's a lot of it.
Right.
They don't want to talk about bad energies. Like none of the beings that live on that side of the supernatural realm, they just like, you know what, we understand it's there. We get it exists. We just, you know,
we leave it alone. Yeah. It leaves us alone.
We leave it alone. We just don't talk about it. And if you talk about it, we're not really going to entertain it. In fact, okay, so actually, a very interesting story is, I haven't told anybody about this, so we're all here. You guys are all hearing this for the first time. It was when I first started getting on camera, and it was, gosh, I wish I could remember the episode it was. I want to say it was within the first 3 months of being on camera for this channel. I think I had done something related to skinwalkers, or it might have been the Hanabe Valley. Either way, there was an original thumbnail that I used that had a native man on it, which I had found on a stock image website. I believe it was Storyblocks. For those that don't know, Storyblocks is it's like one of the big stock video websites you can go to. So there were like several images of this man, and from what I remember of the stock images, he was like a native shaman, I believe. Geographically, it was like Southern California, Arizona, somewhere around there. I don't remember what tribe he was. I don't know if he was Navajo or Apache. Regardless, I get this email out of the blue, probably within a month, and he's like, hey, I noticed the thumbnail, like that's me. He's like, can you please like take it down? And I was like, holy cow, like not the video, the thumbnail. I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem. And I don't think he had any like interest in like the content I did. He just saw that his face was being used without him knowing. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. You know, I'm like, this is from a stock website. But I was like, by the way, I hear from the grapevine, you know, you're a shaman. And I'm like, I've replaced the thumbnail, and I'm like, can you tell me any stories? And well, when he wrote back, everything about him being on the thumbnail seemed to just be fine, and it was whatever. But then he's like, he's like, I actually have quite a few stories I could share with you. He's like, how much money would you be willing to pay me? And I'm like, well, it depends. I'm like, I could pay you hundreds. I'm like, what do you want? Like, what do you want to share? And he's like, I'll have to get back to you. He's like, I don't know if it's stuff I really want to talk about. Just, you know, because as you were saying, he kind of definitely hinted at like, you know, do I really want to like talk about this? Like, because it gets pretty dark. And I'm like, okay, well, just let me know. And I never heard back from him. But so I'm assuming he kind of just decided against it. But it's just one of those things where I'm like, interesting, you know? It's like, oh, wow, what a crazy world.
The Moss Mountain Massacre is really interesting, and that's another one you're going to get a lot more details from Miss Naoma. She has thoroughly researched that. But the Moss Mountain incident, basically there was a naturalist, a guy who cataloged the natural world, cataloged plants and animals and things like that. And right off the top of my head, I can't remember his name. But he led an expedition down into Arkansas. They were looking for different species of birds, and they were documenting the local flora and fauna. And they were, it was a journey for them to basically do like what John James Audubon did, to sketch wildlife and catalog plants. Because this was like the 1820s. This is when they were still exploring, west of the Mississippi. So they took an entire expedition down through southern Arkansas, and in an area that they call Moss Mountain, they stopped because most of the group had gotten sick, either like malaria or something like that. They'd gotten something go all on the journey. It might have been dysentery, but several of the party had gotten sick, so they were going to stop for a couple of days to give everybody a chance to regain their strength. And the night they were on that mountain, it's an area near a river, but while they were camped there, the guy said that he saw large bipedal hairy creatures come into camp and attack the camp, and they killed most of the party. Only like 4 of them escaped, and it's an absolutely brutal account of them being attacked by a clan of Bigfoot. Of course, now he was basically blown off and discredited by the rest of the scientific community, but that's pretty common. Anytime somebody tries to come forward, they're like, oh no, that doesn't happen. But they still can't explain how so many of the party died. Did they just go out there and all decide to shoot themselves? No, something killed that group. And even if they did try to discredit the scientist, they still can't dispute the fact that most of his party was wiped out that night on Moss Mountain.
I interviewed a good friend of mine. He's a famous photographer. He lives in Nashville, and he was just telling me about all the ghost stuff he's had. And his whole thing is like, man, the South is just full of so much like tragic history, a lot of death. You got the Trail of Tears. You got all the warring tribes. I mean, there's just so many things. Of course, when we first came over here, it's not like we came over here and were very peaceful as we expanded, So there's just a lot of strife and conflict. And his whole theory was that he's like, I wonder if that kind of like laid the groundwork for the energy that would attract things. But, again, we're all just theorizing. But it is interesting to me how like it's like Eastern Texas up to like the Midwest, like over to like, Maine and down to Florida. Like there's just so much crap. Not like historical. I mean, there is historical crap.
A lot of weird stuff.
Yeah. Everything from like, satanic rituals and portals to like, hey, we're seeing werewolves and freaking vampires and Bigfoot and like weird stuff, man.
It is bizarre. Some of the local legends and things that have gone on. But that part of Arkansas, that watershed, flows into another water system that would become much more famous later in about roughly 1972. That's the same watershed that's part of the system that flows through Fouke, Arkansas.
Which is where you get the Fouke monster, everybody. Yes.
Yep.
If you haven't heard of that, go ahead and tell them about it.
Where sightings are still happening today. In the early 70s, well, actually for years around Fouke, Arkansas, people would see these big hairy creatures. And of course, people just blew it off. They would find tracks in fields, and where they'd freshly plowed fields, they'd find these big tracks, and occasionally somebody'd see one crossing a road. Well, there was a family living in a cabin out near the swamp, and this thing basically reached through the window and grabbed a guy while he was on the toilet. This was back in days before places like that had air conditioning, so they had their windows open and just the screens to try to keep the house cool. But they ended up shooting at this thing and shooting it a few times, and then abandoned the house and would never go back. The house ended up ultimately caving in. It's not there anymore. But stories continue to come out of those bottoms of people seeing it come up to their house at night. People, animals going missing, dogs going missing. Still find tracks in fields. There's still, road crossings. And I went down to Fouke a couple of years ago. My wife and I went down there, and it was a beautiful place. I mean, but driving some of those back roads around Fouke, I could tell you why you see stuff like that, because that is some dense woods, some very thick woods, and not a whole lot of people. You can drive through Fouke in about a minute. The Honey Island Swamp Monster is an interesting case. I've kind of dug into this one a bit myself, but they were spotting something in the swamp down there, and I'm trying to remember the name of the guy that first spotted the Honey Island Swamp Monster. He was an air traffic controller. He worked in the aviation industry, and he would hunt on Honey Island. And he went out one day and saw something. He was out hunting, and he saw something that was crouched down in the water. And at first he thought it was a hog. And as he got closer, it stood up, and they realized it was this dark-colored creature. Well, it took off, and I can't remember if they shot at it or not, but they were armed. And they found these weird three-toed tracks in the mud. And he wanted to go back and try to get more footage of this thing, or try to film it. And he went back many times over the next few months, and finally, from a blind hidden in a tree, he captured some really interesting footage. And it appears to show this big bipedal hairy creature walking through this swampy area, and it was leaving weird three-toed tracks, very like 18, 19-inch three-toed tracks. Talked to a couple of researchers that have actually been there. They said if you're going to hide a monster, that's a place to do it. That's down in southern Louisiana. That is some thick, heavy-duty swampland. Not a lot of people live out in those swamps, and apparently they're still spotting it today. The Honey Island Swamp Monster is kind of a local legend, but it's slightly different than the Bigfoot stories because of those odd three-toed tracks. And I don't know if that's like a local adaptation or a deformity, but that seems to be consistent with the Honey Island Swamp Monster, is that they keep uniformly finding these odd three-toed tracks.
Do you think there's any correlation to that and the Scape Ore Swamp?
Yeah, Scape Ore Swamp's in South Carolina, and the footage that they got of the Honey Island Swamp Monster, it was covered in hair, but the Scape Ore Swamp was described as being lizard-like. So I don't think there's really much correlation other than the fact that they both occurred in a swamp. Robbie, one of my co-hosts, he's got a good friend that hunts. They hunt in Scape Ore Swamp, and they were hunting alligators one time, and the guide that was taking them out there said, "We were right over one," and they're like, "Where?" And he pointed down off the edge of the boat, and there was a 10-foot 700-pound alligator in 3 feet of water right beneath them, and they didn't see it.
Wow.
So if something that big can hide in 3 feet of water, why couldn't something that's basically a bipedal crocodile or a bipedal lizard?
So that's another thing that I've found interesting is, if anybody listening sifts through some of my old content, I've read things about what people describe as the alligator man down in the south, where it's exactly as it's described, a bipedal alligator crocodilian thing. Multiple stories of him, actually. Honestly, I don't know what to make of him.
I don't either. It's not something I've ever encountered personally. And I have not taken a first-hand account, but I have read some of the stories, and I find them really interesting, if nothing else. I would love to go to those areas. I'd love to have the money to be able to just go, hey, I would give you a call, hey, me and a couple of guys are going down to Honey Island. You want to tag along? I'd love to be able to just afford to do stuff like that. And I have done that in a number of places, but it's all been fairly close to where I live. I mean, but if I had the money, if I won the big lottery, tomorrow, I would grab guys like you and Robbie and Doc and put together a little group, and we would go do our own investigations in some of these places just because I want to know. I mean, I would love to go to Dyatlov Pass. I'd love to go to where the Donner Party incident happened.
And document it all.
Oh, absolutely. Document all of it.
like everyone's wearing GoPros, you know what I mean? Like, you know, multiple like chests for it, you know, just like you don't want to miss a beat.
Right, you want one on your chest, one on your back, and one on where your head, so it points where you look.
Seriously. And then also be carrying like a camera going, just because I feel like in those situations you would want to be documenting, because God forbid someone like misses something and then people are like, yeah, of course he didn't have his camera rolling. You're like, actually, but then but then here comes the other piece of the puzzle, where I've heard that there's a lot of like good legitimate footage, but it either gets confiscated or like, you know, it's like you get told to be taken down. And so this also kind of goes back to the whole thing of where people are like, well, how come all this cryptid footage is always shot on a crappy old flip phone? I'm like, well, you have to take into account, like, most of the time it's not sitting right there, so you got to zoom in, and when you zoom in, what happens the second you move? It's
so it looks a lot of
resolution, stability. So I'm like, there's that aspect of it too. The other aspect of it is, if you were to get like, you know, if you were to shoot, say, like a dogman with a DSLR, people would say like, oh, it's too clear, it's fake, it's too clear. So it's like, what do you people want? Like, I don't know, you know. It's
well, one of the things we've talked about before, and I know I've mentioned this to you, is with the advent of AI technology getting better, it is going to be increasingly difficult to accept any photograph or video as
it already is. It already is. Yeah. So for those, I don't know how many of you guys listening to this are in the field. I use AI extensively for image visual, or essentially for visual assets for my content. So I'm constantly using Midjourney and DALL-E 3. And I'm telling you right now, where we are in 2023, and it's only going to dramatically advance for the next year, you can easily fake trail camera photos of like werewolves and stuff. Unfortunately, there are people that are like really trying to pass this stuff off as like, hey, look at it, it's real. But honestly, as of right now, if you zoom in enough, you could still, Midjourney especially, it has like this, there's something about the texture of certain like forestry or skin where it looks like it's AI, and I'd have to like show you guys like up close what it looks like, but I can spot it out. And so unfortunately, there's already been a couple photos I've seen floating around some Facebook groups where people are like, look at this I found, and I'm like, guys. But a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, like this is terrifying if true. So it just I want everybody to really have your guard up. And honestly, if someone's like, look at this photo I took, you just can't, but same with video is going to be that way soon too, which is unfortunate. But I think the upside to all the fake imagery is that it might, and this is the only upside we really have to look at it as, is that it might show itself to someone who's never like really like entertained the niche, and they see that even though it's fake, they might be like, oh, that is interesting, and now boom, you spark someone's interest in this niche, and it grows larger. So I mean, that's kind of how you have to look at it. Same with like the creepy pasta stories of all like the Wendigos and everything else that goes around on Reddit. Because if you think about it, a lot of people started their interest is just kind of stumbling upon these stories, and they're like, oh, well, even though this is fake, like I want to learn more about it, and therefore this niche grows, which is, so you know, it's a
double-edged sword.
It's a double-edged sword. So honestly, man, it is what it is. There's no way to stop it. The cat's out of the bag. I think, like I said, you just got to be vigilant and not take anything at face value, unfortunately, unless it's from like someone who's really trusted, and they're not like, you know, it's not a psyop. They're not a shill, you know. Yeah. So it's like I think about the only way I would think to completely disprove an image like that, at least for now, is going to be in the metadata. Yes. And that's something that they're looking into, I believe, for the future, is that you can look in the metadata of the photo and trace whether it was AI. But unfortunately, a lot of people, they just see an image pasted on Facebook groups, and they go ham on it.
Well, there's a way around that. You basically eliminate the metadata. Is you get an AI photo, and even if it's a really good looking one, you put it on, you save the image, you put it up on a screen, and then you do a screen cap and crop that. Yeah, you lose some quality, but that metadata is gone. And if there's no metadata, I'd say it's a pretty good indication it's probably a fake image.
There was a woman who had reached out to me, gosh, this is a few months ago on Instagram, and she had showed me a picture, I think that was created by AI, but she's like, hey, like, is this real? And she's like freaking out. And I'm like, no. I'm like, here, let me show you. And I showed her a couple pictures that you can do from Midjourney. and it kind of freaked her out. She's like, oh my gosh. And it's literally as easy going on Google and finding like legitimate pictures and putting them in Midjourney as like a starting point, and to say, hey, I want like, you know, a werewolf standing in a meadow, you know, caught on camera, trail cam, blurry. And like, it's honestly, like if you were just to show someone, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And so it just goes back, man, like you can't trust technology. It sucks.
Yeah.
But, you know, it is what it is, man.
Hey, man, I appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Again, for those of you who might just be tuning in, my name is D.A. Roberts. I'm a best-selling author, Amazon best-selling author. I write primarily horror and sci-fi. I do a lot of cryptid fiction. I'm also a researcher. I've been researching cryptids for the better part of the last 40 years, since I was a kid. And it's something I'm very passionate about. And I do something a little different. Yes, I write primarily fiction, but years of research on the behaviors of these creatures and, you know, evidence and things like that go into the stories. So while the stories themselves are fiction, I've based the behaviors on as much reality in the stories that I can. So hopefully that gives the stories that much more sense of veritas when you read them. I hope you can check them all out. You can find all of my books on Amazon or at daroberts.net. You can find me on any social media at D.A. Roberts Author. It's pretty much unified that way across all my media, so it's easy to find. And I'm on all the big ones, you know, Instagram, TikTok, and all of those. So, you know, look for me there. And we do a twice weekly podcast on Wednesdays and Saturday nights called DAX Machina. We go live every Wednesday and Saturday at 8 p.m. Central Time. So you'd have to adjust for whatever your local time zone is, but we do go live, and we cover a lot of cryptid topics. We talk about UFOs, we talk about horror, we talk about anything that goes bump in the night and is creepy. We talk about it. So we would love to have you guys check us out. You can find us there at youtube.com/DAX Machina podcast. And we would love to have you as part of the DAX Machina Nation. And we would love to see you guys in the chat as well. So hopefully you guys will check us out. And please stop by and let us know that you heard about us from over here at Josh's channel, because Josh has got an amazing channel. He's one of my favorite storytellers. And we had a great time the night he was on our show. And we're definitely going to be doing it again soon. So check us all out. And again, that's daroberts.net. And you can even find the link to the show through the website.
And because you guys have made it this far, I want you to go ahead and all comment down below.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
So that way I know who made it to the end of the video and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy this kind of content and want to see me do more interviews like this, go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button, because I got a bunch of really cool interviews already scheduled and coming down the line. And as always, guys, don't forget, I love you all. Keep an open mind. And I'll see you guys in the very next video.